Hi, welcome back to La Belle and our law and crime content. So this is our weekly wrap up, and today I want to provide an update on the Sarah Boone case and also my initial thoughts on the Murdaugh trial week 1 and another case that I'm thinking of covering. So first for Sarah Boone, so we do have an update on the docket. We have a status hearing this Friday, February 3rd. So I'm showing now the order, and you will see from the order that the court makes very clear in bold caps that the defendant's appearance is mandatory. So I think this means both Sarah and her lawyer, but it's interesting because we know from the last status conference on the 17th of January that her defense attorney was remote because he was getting over COVID. So I think this is a clear signal from the trial court saying, let's move this case along. And then also I'm showing here, also remember, we do have our final pretrial conference on March 28th. And as shown in this order, it looks like we have a 3-week trial scheduled for April 10th. So I will report back next week with updates on the status hearing this coming Friday. So in the meantime, as I mentioned in some of my prior content on the Sarah Boone's case, that her first lawyer, who she had for over 2 years, did quite a bit of work on the case before he wound up filing his motion to withdraw. And so I wanted to go over some of these motions for experts to kind of give a sense of all the work that has been undertaken thus far and kind of where the defense might be going. So this is separate from the battered spouse domestic violence expert that I mentioned in my press video, and that her lawyer mentioned they would probably be potentially pursuing that as a defense. So these are different experts. Okay, so first one, showing here, we have a crime scene expert. This is for crime scene reconstruction and general forensic evidentiary matters. This motion was filed very early in the case in May of 2020, and in February of 2021, the court approved additional costs and hours for the crime scene expert. So we have a crime scene expert. We also have an electronic expert, and the purpose of this expert is to analyze cell tower data and computer and cell phone forensics. So as we know from the interrogation video, that this testimony is going to be critical because of those horrifying videos that we saw on Sarah's phone. But it's also important for the defense to have an electronic expert because, as they mentioned in their motion, the state is going to rely on cell phone tower data to establish her presence on the scene of the crime scene. So that's expert 2. We also have a forensic psychologist. Now, this is a different expert from the battered spouse domestic violence expert that we mentioned. This is just generally a forensic psychologist, and this person was requested to perform a psychological analysis and evaluation of Sarah Boone herself. We also have a private investigator, very common. This was approved officially in November of 2020. It was initially for 125 hours, but then the defense filed a motion for additional authorization of 150 hours in September of 2021. So that is 4. We also have a mitigation specialist. Now, this turns out to be the same company that they retained for the private investigator services, but it is a separate specialist. And the purpose of the mitigation specialist is to find evidence that can help support or mitigate Sarah's defense at trial. And finally, we have a forensic pathologist, And a forensic pathologist basically is there to analyze the case evidence, a lot of the medical data, etc. So, as you can see, a lot of work has been undertaken in the Sarah Boone defense. So, hopefully, this means that we're going to get closer to that trial date. But one last thing I thought was interesting, there was a motion in September of 2021 for costs. And again, this was still when Mr. Padilla was her lawyer. And this was for costs for her lawyer and her her private investigator to travel out of state of Florida to specifically Massachusetts and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to investigate and interview witnesses. Now we know from Sarah's interrogation video that George was from the Massachusetts and Pennsylvania areas, and I believe we even know from that video that his ex-wife and his children, I believe, live in Philadelphia. So we don't know if they went, but it would be interesting to know. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting. But then again, in any event, just to wrap up, Sarah Boone, I will give an update next weekend after we find out what happens at this Friday's status conference. So in the meantime, the other case I'm handling, which I think everyone's handling at this point, is the really fascinating Murdaugh double murder trial. And I'm not live streaming it. Obviously, there's tons of people live streaming it, but I am listening to it each day. And I think it's the takeaway I have after the first week, and it's also the question I have after the first week, which is still not answered, of course, is why was Alex so seemingly clean at the crime scene? And so they've released video now of his interview in the detectives in the SLED officer's car. And I think it was around 1 o'clock in the morning. He looks clean. I mean, he certainly look like someone that had been kind of around the crime scene, because unfortunately, as we know from the devastating testimony that we've heard so far, that the crime scene was really bloody and there was a lot of body matter around. And so I think the prosecution's obviously going to use this to say, well, you didn't check them, you're clean because you didn't get yourself money, and you didn't check for a pulse because you're lying. You knew they were deceased because you killed them. Whereas, I think also it'll be interesting to see what testimony comes out with this raincoat we've been hearing about. Is the prosecution going to argue that maybe Alec changed clothes? So that's going to be very interesting. But the fact that he's clean can also be used by the defense just as easily. The prosecution can use it. And the defense, I think, is going to argue, look, he's so clean, he couldn't have done it. Otherwise, he would have blood everywhere. And so I think that that's going to be super interesting to find out, kind of like, why was he so clean and why wasn't he bloody? But those are my open questions for the day. And as I mentioned, I'll be continuing to cover that trial. So one last trial that I'm going to for sure cover, and this is a good week to kind of jump back into this one, is the Rust case. Now, remember, earlier this month, the prosecutors in New Mexico indicated they would be filing involuntary manslaughter charges against Alec Murdaugh and Hannah Gutierrez Reed, the armorer in the Rust movie set tragedy. I'm sure you know, but that was the case where the Rust movie set was filming in New Mexico, and unfortunately, the cinematographer was killed by a gunshot wound, and the director was also seriously hurt. So in any event, those should be filed early this week, because we've got, Wednesday's February 1st, which is crazy. So my assumption is that we will see that very early this week. So in the meantime, I'm going to cover that, but I'm also going back over a bunch of material that the Santa Fe Sheriff's Office previously released pursuant to a FOIA request. And there's a lot of information in there, so I'm going to be doing some content on that and some things that I don't know that I've necessarily seen yet, in anticipation of hopefully that trial potentially going forward. So we'll see. But in any event, thank you again for joining this weekly wrap up of our law and crime content. Again, my name is Carol and I'm with La Belle, and I want to thank you so much for joining. And if you would consider liking and subscribing, that would be wonderful. And in the meantime, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.